This presentation and accompanying handout are copyrighted material. Copyright 2021, Margaret M. McMahon Teaching and Training Company, LLC. All rights reserved. Hello, I'm Margaret McMahon, and I'm here with Write Their Story From Timeline to Young Reader's Book, and this is part 2 of a 2-video series. In part 2, we'll put pages together one by one, we'll find images, we'll talk about the other parts of the book, and then some publishing choices, and then I'll show you an example based on the book I put together using this process. Now, if you haven't caught it, part 1 introduced the whole process, told you the decisions you'll need to make up front, discussed timelines, and how to get the book started. Now it's time to put pages together one by one. And now it's time to write the pages. What you're going to use is the timeline as your outline. You're going to take items from the timeline, usually one per page, and incorporate them into the story. When you take the item off the timeline, the event will have minimal details, so you want to flesh it out with a sentence or two. Then you're going to want to go back to your research. And that's where you can find the details that are really going to bring the story to life, so you'll want to include them. Now you may find that some descriptions need more than 1 or 2 sentences. And it's okay if you have one page that just has 2 or 3 short paragraphs with no visual elements. But for most pages, you'll take a picture and add it to the page. Now, a picture might be a photo, it might be a document that you already have. Then you'll have a page. Well, you start with your timeline and a blank page. You take an event from the timeline, put it into a sentence or 2, and then you go back and look at your research. And you may have details from records or perhaps some conclusions that you made, and maybe even some of that context information that brings this part of the story to life. And you'll add them and flesh out the text that you've written. Then you'll choose an appropriate image, put it on the page, and you've got a full page complete. Now, as the story's being told, you may find some holes. The story may just suggest questions to you. And the important thing to know is at this level of book, you don't have to answer all those questions. You don't have to have every single detail that you think of. You can generalize if you have some conflicting or missing data. You certainly want to always tell the true story. But an example would be, did my grandfather leave from a ferry on the Upper West Side of Manhattan or go all the way down to 23rd Street to cross over to New Jersey to get the train to head to his training camp in South Carolina? For this level of book, you can make those generalizations. And of course, this is a way that writing can help your research. Every decision you make, every question you have, I want you to keep notes about it because it will be important to moving forward with finding out more about this person's history. There are a few caveats with young readers' books. Of course, you want to pick images, the kind that you enjoyed as a child reading the books, something that's interesting to look at. But you also have to keep in mind that young readers may pick up the book. So always have appropriate language and make sure that the contents are suitable for the young readers. Well, if you're like me and don't have any images to go along with the story, you've got to be wondering where you can find them. Well, if you have your own copies of records or photos or illustrations, definitely use them. But you can also find some online. You might even want to consider using maps. Maps are a big part of family history, so if they're appropriate to the topic, go ahead and use them in the book. But if you don't have your own images, you can find ones of people doing the same things your family were doing at the same time. Now, be sure that the picture can be used legally, and definitely, if it's required, use credit for the picture. One place is the Library of Congress. They actually have a portal of pictures that are free to use and reuse. They even have children's books in if you wanted to use illustrations, things like that. So definitely check out this website. Another great place to find pictures is the National Archives and Records Administration, NARA. They even have a part of their site devoted to pictures that are of interest to genealogists. And this is where I found a lot of my military photos. You can find photos from all different aspects of American history, but always check the permissions, again, to be sure that it's okay to use them in your book. There are websites with royalty-free images, and one example is Pixabay, and these images can be free to use and reuse, so definitely, again, check the rights before you use a picture from that site. Another way to find images online is advanced Google search. So I gave the web address here to go right to the advanced search, and in there you're going to look for images that are free to use or share, even commercially, and use, share, or modify commercially. But of course, Google does the best it can. You are responsible to make sure that the picture is legal to use. What about the other parts of the book? Well, the book title is fairly important. You may already have one, or one may be very obvious from the material that you're covering. Otherwise, you might want to look at some of the keywords, some of the important words in the story, and you can even go to a title generator website. Now, these are going to generate loads of titles. Not all of them are going to be useful, but they can get your imagination stimulated. You can also take the particular detailed name of the book and maybe use that as a subtitle. For instance, I knew I wanted to use the Pioneer Infantrymen as a subtitle and pick something catchier as the first title. The cover is also important. You want to include, at a minimum, the title, the author, and an image. Sometimes you don't even need an image. It is nice for a young person's book. You want an image to be simple and definitely relate to the story. Now, in the handout, I've put a link to a place that describes how to use color wheels. So you can use a color wheel to figure out which colors go together, which contrast, and which would be nice to use. Now, the publisher, if you're using an online self-publishing place, may have a cover designing tools, or you may just go ahead and use a graphics program that you're familiar with and get the measurements of the cover and design it yourself. Once the pages are put together, you've got your title, you've put together your cover, it's time to review the manuscript. Now, doing the grammar and spelling, if you're using a word processing document, will work pretty well, but you need some other eyes on the manuscript. So get some friends. If you have someone who's good at editing, that's always great. And get those extra eyes looking at things like missing words. Your brain can fill in a word that's supposed to be there, and soon you won't even notice it's missing. And also, you want to have sentences that make sense. You've written these sentences, they make sense to you, and you've read them so often that they definitely keep making sense. So getting someone else to put their eyes on sentences and see, does it really work? Is a general reader going to pick up what you mean? And the other thing, of course, is consistency. If you say something in one place, is it still true later on? And now there are questions about how do you even publish the book? Well, the choices we talked about in the other video are about creating a digital copy that you could share. Now that can be done by using a word processing document, as I like to do, or if you did a book by hand, like a scrapbook, you could always scan the pages. That way you could deliver things even by email. The other option is, of course, printing out a hard copy and distributing it at family gatherings. It's kind of nice when people have something to hold. But the option that I go with is the self-publishing one. And in self-publishing, you have two big choices. One is whether you want an ebook, something that you can read on a Kindle or other kind of electronic book reader, or a paperback. Now, for many places, you can get a hardcover book, but that's usually a lot more expensive. So some online publishing examples. Kindle Direct Publishing would be one. That's the Amazon publishing company. Lulu is another, and Blurb would be yet another. Now they want you to use their services, so they're going to have tutorials and all sorts of help on their web pages to get you going and walk you through the steps of fitting your manuscript and uploading it, verifying it, and then of course ordering copies. Well, here's an example from the book that I published using this method. I started out looking into my grandfather's World War I service, and there really wasn't a lot. His personnel file had been destroyed in the fire in 1973 in St. Louis, and it wasn't a file that could be found because the archivists now can potentially do restoration, which is amazing. But they couldn't even find his. So I really had to start from scratch with that service abstract form and just a few dates. And as I built up the timeline, as I went to each resource, each book, each archive, wrote each letter to other places to get information, I compiled everything. And I said to myself, I have so much here, and I can help the other families who are descendants of these men who fought in the 51st Pioneer Infantry Regiment. So I put it together, all the material, and wrote a book. And it was pretty successful. There's even someone who wrote to me and said they used it as a tour book when they retraced their grandfather's travel through France. So then, as I'm collecting material about these little-known soldiers, I came to collect more and more material and wrote a book about an even bigger group, all the 37 regiments that were formed of pioneer infantrymen. But I was far from doing the story that I really wanted to do. I wanted to tell my grandfather's story. So I scaled back and I looked at what I had, and that's how this process came to be. I didn't have a lot of personal items, but I had a lot of research, and I knew where to find representative images to convey the story and the ideas. So that's where Marching in Mules came from. Now, the story itself, without the timeline, which I included for people for reference, and the acknowledgments and other front pages, the story at its core is just around 4,000 words and 86 pages. Now, if you take all the pages, we've got just over 4,400 words and 99 pages. So I'm still in the zone of the young reader's book. Now, going through the steps that I took for my book, the decisions I made were that it would be about my grandfather's military service in World War I. I knew I'd want to use images. I'd want them from World War I and also some maps. I knew I wanted a physical book, and I was going to self-publish it. The collected material started with his military service abstract and got fleshed out with records from narrative, from the diaries, which are so important for contextual information, with photo collections. And then the timeline, I started with that abstract and I filled it in as I went through the research. I filled it in from military records, from books that I found, and even newspapers that had some mentions. I put the timeline in a word processing document because I wanted to be able to cut and paste between the timeline and the pages of the book. As far as images, I had nothing from his World War I service. I did have his naturalization certificate, so I used an image of that in the book. But for the most part, I relied on NARA for the photos. Also, Navy Archives and the Army Archives also provided some from their collections. I knew in the title I would need a U.S. pioneer infantryman in World War I because that's what he was. But that's not a really catchy title. So I said, let me use that as a subtitle, and in fact use some of the keywords about the things I read most about. Marching and mules. All infantrymen march. And the mules were specific to their work. In fact, I found one letter at NARA where the 51st had asked, could we please have our mules back? We don't like this truck that you've given us. It just doesn't work as well on the roads, and it isn't as sturdy as our mules are. Well, for the cover, since I've done this before, I did create my own. I used the KDP measurements. They told me specifically how big the title cover had to be, where the title had to be placed. And I did it using canva.com, which is a website that's usually used for memes. As far as reviewers, I was lucky enough to have 3 who were interested, and they each got a free book for helping me. For the publishing choice, which I think you can figure out, I did use the Kindle Direct Publishing. Now for the timeline, I started with that service abstract, as I said, and then I filled it in with what I found during my research. And I ended up with pages of this timeline. And it was so interesting, and I thought it would help descendants from the 51st pioneers, so I actually included it in this short book. And here's developing the book in action. I took a line from the timeline, and from May to July in 1918, they were training as pioneer infantrymen. I knew that infantrymen were training to march. The pioneers also had some engineering duties that they trained for, so I was able to use general pictures of infantrymen at the same camp marching. Here's another example page. I built it with an event from the timeline where they marched to a landing, took a ferry, and then went to the ship that would take them to France. So I made the sentence, which was pretty brief, but I went into my research for the context. And the context is that the ships were painted in a dazzle paint job. The idea being that the enemy would have trouble tracking the ship. This paint job would make it tough to figure out what kind of ship it was, how fast it was going, and where it was headed. And of course, there's a picture of the ship from one of the archives. In the category of interesting pictures, mules had to line up just like soldiers for inspection. And in the other picture, it wasn't just the soldiers who took ships to France. The mules had to be transported as well so they could do their work. What's next? Definitely, after writing the book, rejoice, enjoy, and definitely enjoy sharing it with your family members. How about it? It was pretty straightforward. What about writing another? Maybe writing a series of books. I would enjoy a series with the ancestors who served in the military in my family. Or maybe a series about the different immigrants in your family. And the way that you use the timeline to create this young reader's book, what if you use the young reader's book to write the adult version, the version with all the research that brings in all of the details? I hope you look for my books on Amazon, including Write Their Story, From Timeline to Young Reader's Book, and of course the book that was written using the process Marching in Mules. You can find information at Amazon and also at my webpage. I'd like to thank you for joining me, and I hope you've been inspired to tell their story, from timelines to Young Reader's Book. And you can always reach me at aweekofgenealogy@gmail.com.